For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. In early January, President Trump ordered a drone strike targeting Qassem Soleimani, who is the head of the Quds Force in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. My guest today is Russ Read. He's a defense reporter for the Washington Examiner. So Russ, first of all, how big is this drone strike targeting Qassem Soleimani?
It's hard to downplay how big it can be in terms of the implications it'll have for not just Iran, but the United States as well. Qassem Soleimani was largely considered Iran's mastermind in the region, and losing him is going to be an absolutely huge loss for the Iranians.
Where are people not really understanding when it comes to this airstrike because it happened at a time where tensions really seem to be bubbling over?
I think the thing that people don't understand is that Iran does not operate in a very traditional way in terms of how a state engages with other states. The Iranians have always kind of operated in the shadows ever since 1979 when they founded their Islamic Revolution. I think what people don't get about Soleimani is that he operates in this kind of gray zone. He's technically in a paramilitary role, but he really serves as kind of an intelligence collector, a master worker in terms of coordinating their proxy groups. He also engages in a good bit of diplomacy as well, some would say. So he's not really just one guy. He's not just a military leader. He really is like this kind of puppet master for the Iranians in terms of how they operate in the Middle East.
What kind of role did Soleimani play, not in just the Quds Force, but sort of the giant dynamic as a whole within Iranian politics?
He was a huge figure. For a guy who spent most of his career in the shadows, he's kind of a celebrity, right? There's actually, when I was covering the ISIS fight in 2015, you'd see literally Twitter selfies of soldiers with Soleimani. He's that big. He has a music video actually in his honor. You can look it up on YouTube. It's right there. So not only is he just a huge figure in terms of just his popularity, but he serves in a really important role in terms of being kind of an interlocutor for the Iranian regime elsewhere.
To understand just how big Qassem Soleimani was in Iran, you have to go back to August 1953, when the CIA, with the help of MI6, the British intelligence service, orchestrated a coup d'etat of the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, to strengthen the power of Iran's Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as monarch. The Shah was considered a puppet dictator of the United States who brutally oppressed his own citizens using a secret police force known as Savak that detained, tortured, and executed political dissidents. As the country descended into political turmoil and civil unrest in 1978, the Shah and his family left Iran for exile in January 1979, never to return. Ruhollah Khomeini, an Islamic cleric who was exiled in 1964 for publicly denouncing the Shah, returned to Iran in February 1979 to lead a movement that resulted in establishing an Islamic republic to replace the monarchy, adopting a new constitution, and ascending to supreme leader. Soleimani, who was in his early 20s during the revolution, joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, where he rose through the ranks quickly through his service in the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s. While still in his 20s, he became commander of the 41st Thurala Division and engaged in most major operations in the war. Having garnered a high reputation within Iranian military circles, Soleimani was appointed as the head of the IRGC's Quds Force around late 1997, early 1998. He commanded the unit until his death in January 2020. There seems to be this cult of personality surrounding Soleimani, and targeting him, killing him, is in some ways a lot of people are discussing it's bigger than killing Osama bin Laden in 2011, and it's bigger than killing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in 2019. Does that actually fit that hype? Is he bigger than those two?
Obviously, it's a matter of perspective, but I think he certainly is in that league, right? He's in that conversation in terms of major figures in the Middle East. In terms of versus al-Baghdadi, he has had a lot more years involved in the Middle Eastern politics. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in the grand scheme of history, was a flash in the pan. Soleimani's got like 3 decades of experience. Osama bin Laden, about the same amount. So if you really look at him in terms of his caliber. Huge guy, a huge get, and a very, very important player. I mean, he's probably a once-in-a-generation kind of figure, and I think the Iranians are really going to feel that.
For those who don't really grasp the dynamic in Iran, what exactly is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps?
Right, really important question, right? Because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is kind of a paramilitary force within the construct of the Iranian military. So the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was founded during the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979, and basically they kind of are operating as a sort of counterweight to the traditional military. The idea being they're there to protect the revolution. That's their end-all be-all. Make sure the Islamic Revolution continues. So the Quds Force is a force within that group that Soleimani heads up, and their job is to go conduct covert operations abroad, coordinate with Iran's proxies, and engage in support of terrorism, things like that.
So how important are these particular groups to the Iranian regime?
Oh, very key. I mean, the Iranian regime does not have a conventional military force in the way that the United States or even if its allies in the Arabian Peninsula do. So for them, covert operations, engaging in proxy warfare, gray zone warfare, sometimes a term you hear thrown around a lot, stuff that's really kind of not official, not on the books, super important for them. Very key in implementing their strategy in the Middle East.
What's the kind of activity that you could shed some light on that they've done in the Middle East?
Oh, sure. So a lot of things with their fingerprints on it. The most notable and most recent, I think, is the fight against ISIS. The Quds Force and the IRGC were widely believed to be supporting what are called the Popular Mobilization Forces, or Hashd al-Shabi. Those are the Iraqi units that kind of sprung up and fought against ISIS when the Iraqi military kind of fell apart. So very important role they played there. Historically, support of Lebanon's Hezbollah. Israel obviously sees that as a major problem. And then even more recently, the Yemen fight, Palestinian terrorism, you name it, they've probably been there in some context.
So in the context of, say, the fight against ISIS, because a lot of, not sympathizers to Iran, but certainly those who are taking a look, who maybe are critics of, say, President Trump's decision to target Soleimani, highlight the fight against ISIS as a reason that Soleimani should not have been targeted. First of all, could ISIS have been defeated without the Quds Force, or without the PMF, or without Soleimani?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, it's difficult because when ISIS really rose up in 2014, 2015, they just really ran roughshod over the Iraqi security forces. And there was no coordination, not a lot of good funding there necessarily, despite the fact that they had U.S. backing. There was just a lot of problems within that construct. So it's difficult to play counterfactual historian,
Right.
But there's absolutely no doubt that they were leaned on heavily, so much so that the Iraqis brought them in as an official part of their military. I mean, I think people really understate the value in that. Getting the PMF to be part of the official Iraqi security forces was a huge move in terms of Iranian influence.
From your reporting, how do you think President Trump came to this decision? Because there have been some conflicting reports saying that Trump was acting sort of like on a whim, and then there are other reports saying that this was months in the making.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure that the U.S. security forces have been watching Soleimani for a very long time. Right. I mean, a guy that powerful certainly has a lot of eyeballs on him, no doubt. In terms of what we've been hearing from the administration, imminent threat is the term that they've been using. Exactly what that means, I mean, it's difficult to say, but if you look at what Kataib Hezbollah, one of the PMFs, did recently, they killed a U.S. contractor, right? They engaged in a rocket attack. There's been significant issues with Soleimani for a very long time. I mean, this guy was responsible, or at least partially responsible, for helping Iran kill 600 plus U.S. service members during the occupation. So this guy's been a problem for a long time. As to how the decision was made, that's, the guys in the West Wing would know better.
Who else did the U.S. target in these airstrikes?
So the big guy that was in this other one, it was Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. That guy is actually a huge get in and of himself. Not as well known, I think, as Soleimani is, doesn't have that same cult of personality. But this guy founded Kataib Hezbollah, which has been around, I think, since 2003. They were a problem during the occupation for U.S. forces. Muhandis himself is a dual Iraqi-Iranian national. His roots go back with Iran to like the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. I mean, there's a lot of history there. And so he also serves, going back to what I mentioned, when the PMF came into the Iraqi security forces officially, he was deputy commander of the PMF. So a very high-ranking official in terms of his influence.
Yeah. I mean, why was someone like Soleimani in Iraq? I mean, of course, the Quds Force is a paramilitary force that usually carries out operations outside of Iran. But could some say that he was being careless in sort of where he was at the time?
Well, it's difficult to say, right? I mean, he got killed right outside of Baghdad airport. I mean, who's to know if he felt there was a threat against his life? It sounds like, based on some of the folks who've spoken to me, that he was on a sort of VIP access road when he was hit. There's a main highway out of Baghdad to the airport, and there's an access road beside it. Apparently, my understanding is they were about to hit that road when he got hit. So who's to know exactly? But it sounds like he was there doing something with Muhandis. He wouldn't have been in the car with him otherwise. So did he get sloppy? I mean, who knows? I mean, he was taking selfies with troops 4 or 5 years ago, right? I mean, this is a guy who has definitely been in the public eye more than a spy chief or spy master type of person normally would. So it's difficult to say whether or not he got sloppy or not, but only he knows that, and he can't answer it.
Right. So Soleimani in particular is interesting because this came days after a protest, a violent protest against the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, which to many people who have seen it is a fortress. I mean, it should be able to stave off like any sort of terrorist attack. Yet you had a number of protesters throwing Molotov cocktails, basically trashing the entire place. Was this sort of airstrike against Soleimani considered sort of unprovoked, or is this direct retaliation for that U.S. Embassy attack?
It's difficult to say because the administration doesn't really necessarily give off any hints of that. But as I said before, Soleimani is largely responsible for the deaths of hundreds of service members going back, over a decade. As to whether or not this is retaliation for the violent protests themselves, I don't know, but there certainly is a history there. There certainly is a clear example of Iranian influence becoming a little less under the table and overtly over the table. I mean, when you see that rocket attack that killed that U.S. contractor, that's pretty significant. And I think if you look at Iraqi-Iranian relations recently, it's not been as secretive as it once was. Now it's pretty much out in the open. So there's definitely a track record.
How is the Iranian regime responding to the death of Soleimani?
I think they are responding as expected. It was obviously a huge blow, and it's being treated as such. I think there actually was an IRGC leader who was crying on camera in a very weepy way. The crowds that came out for his funeral procession were huge. And they've obviously stated things like, oh, we'll retaliate in our own time. Exactly what that means, who's to know? But the Iranian regime is done quite a bit to signify how important this is. Most importantly, however, yesterday, which is Sunday, they basically told the world that they're no longer going to abide by the Iran nuclear agreement uranium stockpiling limits, which is a huge announcement. Whether or not they go through with it or not is another thing, but there's clearly been some serious responses on the part of the regime.
Let's talk a little bit about the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, agreed to by the P5+1 nations. It's the UN Security Council as well as Germany. Interestingly enough, with respect to the Iran nuclear deal, a lot of defenders of it believe that it was working, citing that the IAEA was basically saying that during the inspections, Iran was at least upholding their end of the deal. Critics of the deal look at it as saying there was nothing really stopping Iran from potentially building a bomb. They were still doing ICBM testing, or at least some level of missile testing. What's your read on this particular aspect of it? Because it seems like 2015 is happening all over again.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Them removing themselves from these restrictions, whether or not that was actually going to be the case anyway, it remains to be seen. It's kind of unclear because you might remember after Trump removed the United States from the agreement, the Iranians made similar claims, right? They said, we're no longer going to abide by certain things if you do that then. The biggest issue here is the Europeans, right? The Europeans have set up kind of this interesting trade mechanism to avoid U.S. sanctions, to still do business with the Iranians, or at least it's still in existence as far as I know. That is going to be an interesting factor because that's a really important, lucrative relationship for both sides. If the Iranians just kind of say, we're not even going to do the bare minimum anymore, I think that might put Europe in an interesting position because obviously the United States isn't going to abide by that. Of course, will they follow through with this? That's another question in and of itself.
Well, let's get to the more burning question, and that's obviously in the immediate aftermath to the airstrike targeting Soleimani was that this was the start of escalating military conflict, possibly war. Some people have even talked about World War III. What's the likelihood of this actually happening?
In terms of an all-out conventional war, it's pretty difficult to see that happening because of the fact that Iran conventionally just isn't all there. They barely have an air force. It's mostly planes they've cobbled together from 30 years ago. Their land component is serviceable, but their navy is really non-existent. It's very difficult to see how a real all-out war would occur. I mean, who would they attack, right? Would it be, they're not going to attack Iraq. Would they attack Saudi Arabia, Kuwait? Would they try to target the United States in the Persian Gulf? Maybe that last one is a little bit more realistic, but in terms of an all-out war, I don't know if either side really wants that. I know Trump said after the strike, he said, we did this to prevent a war, not start one, kind of, obviously adjusting that a little bit. But the Iranians, too, I think, as much as they might be upset, difficult to see them wanting to pursue something all out.
Less than a week after the U.S. airstrike that killed Soleimani, Iran's IRGC launched a ballistic missile strike targeting 2 Iraqi military bases, housing U.S. military personnel. There were no American or Iraqi casualties. Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif issued a statement shortly after the strike, posting on Twitter, quote, Iran took and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense under Article 51 of UN Charter targeting base from which cowardly armed attack against our citizens and senior officials were launched. We do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression, end quote. The next morning, President Trump issued an address to the nation defending his decision to take out Soleimani, while also keeping all options on the table in response to Iran's airstrike.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well.
What's interesting here is that there's been some concern about Iran possibly activating sleeper cells within the United States or within the Western world amongst maybe one of our allies and attacking them and trying to basically coax a response. But of course there's been reports that Iran has been operating proxies even within, say, Central America, possibly looking at, coming up through the southern border, which is a topic for another day in terms of talking about our immigration system.
Sure.
But is there ever a concern about that? I mean, is Iran capable of escalating it to the point where there's a massive attack against the United States?
It depends on kind of what you define as massive, right? Like
9/11. Let's just use that as a standard.
Yeah. So 9/11, I don't know if it would be possible after 9/11 to really pull off something like that. Our intelligence services and security services are very keenly aware that radical terrorism like this is a problem, have been for 20 odd years, give or take. So I don't know if something that coordinated could occur. But in terms of sleeper cells or something like that, you are right in the sense that there has been concern of Iranian influence in South America for some time. In terms of operating some kind of sleeper cells in the United States, I don't know if those exist. However, if you look at Iran's track record, they do have a lot of experience in placing terrorists in areas in which they would like to inflict some pain. I would point out Israel being the number one, in addition to the insurgency in Iraq at the time. So that's always going to be a risk, right? There's always going to be nations that are like Iran who don't have the conventional capabilities that the United States does are always going to look for ways to inflict harm in ways like that. As to whether or not it's a realistic possibility, it's hard to say.
And you mentioned Israel. What kind of risk is Israel being put at if, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have distanced himself a bit from saying that this was a U.S. airstrike. Israel had nothing to do with it. Is he sort of trying to at least absolve the state of Israel and at least try to protect themselves or shield themselves from possibly any Iranian retaliation?
Well, I think Israel, just given its vicinity, would be a target no matter what, and it always has been, right? Hezbollah right now has gotten a lot of experience fighting in Syria, and they're just right north of Israel. At any given time, Hezbollah could be shooting rockets into northern Israel, and they'd have to take care of it as best they could. Right. They've lived under that threat for years. Right. They know how to operate like that. I mean, you go and you see Israelis, they know, but they just kind of continue with their lives. In terms of Netanyahu's statements, this is a huge win in a sense for them, you could say, because Soleimani was obviously one of their biggest problems. He's now gone. At the same time, I'm sure Netanyahu is keenly aware that he is, the first target on the board in terms of distance. I don't really think he's the type of guy who distances himself from things, and I don't think that would make a difference very much for Iran anyway. So I think for Netanyahu, it's probably just one of those wait-and-see sort of situations. That's how Israel operates a lot of the time. They kind of just don't say much until they're very ready to. And so maybe he's just trying to kind of see how it all plays out.
Well, Russ Read, our defense reporter with the Washington Examiner, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And that's our show for today. Subscribe to the podcast on whichever podcast app you're using, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Ricochet, Stitcher, what have you. Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com, and be sure to follow us on Twitter @DCExaminer. You can also follow me on there. I'm at Siraj Hashmi. And by all means, tell your friends and family about the show. As always, thanks to all who were involved in the creation of this podcast, from the Washington Examiner team, my family and friends, and to you, the listener, for being a part of the journey. For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out.